Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. It's good to be with you. Thanks for joining us. President Biden is on the road again to sell his economic plan directly to the American people. He's speaking soon in his hometown of Scranton, Pennsylvania, to tout his multi-trillion-dollar social and climate package, even as he's actively involved in negotiating it within his party. We will take you to Scranton live when that happens. After a flurry of meetings and negotiations, Democrats are sounding more united on the president's social and climate spending plan. President Biden outlined a new framework to Democrats Tuesday. We're now getting a sense of some of the items that may or may not be included in the final bill. Party leaders say they'll present an outline by week's end. New polling from Politico and the Morning Consult shows just 38% of voters believe the country is heading in the right direction. That's a potential liability for Democratic control of the House and the Senate heading into the midterms. The Washington Post reports that over 1.7 million migrants along the Mexican border have been detained during fiscal year 2021. The last time numbers were that high, Ronald Reagan was president. The biggest change since then, the Biden administration's enforcement of Title 42. That is a Trump-era policy allowing the U.S. to expel people before they can request immigration experts say that leads to people repeatedly crossing into the U.S. Plus, hours after the House Capitol Riot Committee held contempt hearings for former Trump advisor Steve Bannon, Mark Meadows is lawyering up. The former White House chief of staff is retaining George Terwilliger, who served as Deputy Attorney General under President George W. Bush. Let's bring in Kris Van Cleave, Natalie Jennings, and Tim Puko. Kris is a CBS News congressional correspondent. Natalie is deputy Washington editor at the Washington Post, and Tim is a reporter for the Wall Street Journal. Welcome to you all. Kris, let me start with you. President Biden laid out a rough framework for his social spending plan. What is the latest price tag, and what do we know about which programs seem to be making the cut?
Well, Elaine, we have to preface this with the negotiations are still underway, so what's in today could be out tomorrow. But right now, what our CBS News teams at the White House and here at the Capitol are hearing, you're looking at a bill that's probably going to come in between $1.75 and $1.95 trillion. The president has been referring to it as a $2 trillion package. And because that's substantially smaller than that $3.5 trillion, that means some things are going to have to come out and some programs are not going to run as long. I've got my cheat sheet here because things keep changing. But, what we're hearing is the goal from the president is to have an agreement in place, at least in principle, and a public agreement on things so that a vote could happen on the infrastructure bill by October 30th. That's ahead of the president's international trip, and it would be a victory for a White House that could certainly use one. Family leave is looking like it's staying in, but it's going to get considerably shorter. It had been maybe 12 weeks now, closer to 4 weeks. There'll be a means test at about $100,000 as a cap. Child tax credit staying in, but likely going to be extended for 1 or 2 years. There had been hope of making that permanent, but still extending it gives something that's very popular to people that are running for re-election for sure there. Funding for child care and universal pre-K is still under discussion. It sounds like universal pre-K is likely to stay in, but those details are still being debated. Climate change, that's a big part of this bill, and that's still being figured out. And, of course, we haven't gotten to the pay-fors. Will there be a change in SALT, the state and local taxes that moderates in the House really want to see changed? We know that Senator Sinema has some issues with some of the tax increases. So how you pay for all of this, that we're not hearing a lot about yet.
All right. So, Tim, Kris says unclear, right, on climate right now. But can you just lay out the stakes here? Because when it comes to a climate agenda here, Joe Biden has been very vocal about, his commitment to this. And I wonder, as these negotiations continue here, just how fraught have those particular discussions when it comes to climate and clean energy, how fraught have those discussions been?
Well, there's a huge challenge for him in that he needs every single Democrat, and one of the most powerful Democrats there is comes from one of the country's leading producers of coal and coal-fired power. And so to make advancements on climate change, you both have to convince Joe Manchin in the Senate to join 49 other Democrats and vote for it, but also present him something that he can vote for. And that's an incredibly tight needle for this White House and other allies in the Democratic Party to thread. The other thing that I'll mention is that not only does he have to contend with this audience domestically and get every senator on board, but the deadline that's coming up at the end of the month is important internationally. There is the biggest international climate conference that we've seen in years in Glasgow. The president will be there for the 1st of November. And if he wants to make progress on climate change, that has to be with international partners. The U.S. cannot do it alone. President Biden has said that many times. He's acknowledged that, and his strategy is to make sure that he shows the U.S. is doing something, is taking concrete action in order to get credibility internationally. It's something that the U.S. hasn't had a whole lot of. The U.S. policy on climate change has changed repeatedly, going back for decades. And if there's not legislation that comes through Congress through this reconciliation package, which would be a huge amount of spending, an unprecedented amount for the U.S. On climate change, he's limited in what he can take to international partners to get them on board. So it's, as I said, a very tight needle to thread, but on several fronts, not just one.
Well, Tim, you mentioned Senator Manchin. He has vocally opposed a clean electricity plan. President Biden has had several meetings with him. I'm just wondering, do we know at this point whether or not there is a component of a climate initiative or some element dealing with climate that we know Senator Manchin is willing to accept? Or is this, at this point, in the negotiation process, appearing as though Senator Manchin is not moving at all on this issue of climate?
I wouldn't say that he's not moving at all, but he is also keeping his red lines pretty tightly out of the public realm. I don't think he has made it entirely clear what is acceptable to him and what is not. Obviously, that's something that he probably wants to do. That's a path that he wants to chart in order to ensure that he has a lot of leverage here. Yesterday, we did hear from the president saying that it seemed like the clean electricity plan that you mentioned is out. Obviously, that we reported last week that is because Senator Manchin has told people in the administration, certainly in the Senate, that he doesn't support it. A carbon tax, that was something else that we reported yesterday, is likely out. One thing that seems very important from what we can tell for Senator Manchin is that he can't have things that directly lead to the closing of coal-fired power plants, of more coal-fired power plants, or shut off further coal production. Those are things that are incredibly important to West Virginia. And some of the things that we're talking about, those two things in particular, are things that would that political opponents could probably say will directly lead to the closing of those plants and that production. That really integral part of the West Virginia economy. And so one thing that I would say that I'd look for is more tax credits. If this gets done, the supporters, the people who are optimistic about this, say that tax credits first, second, and third for new deployment, new capacity is at the top of the list of what's likely to stay.
So for existing power plants to try these new technologies, cleaner technologies, are moving and expanding essentially, but not necessarily sort of reducing what already may exist, especially in the case of West Virginia, as you say, no closures of plants. Natalie, let me turn to you. Democrats want some sort of a win heading toward the midterms. New polling from Politico and Morning Consult shows that just 38% of voters say the country is heading in the right direction. So how much rides on getting this deal done by the end of the month?
Look, for the 2022 midterms to go their way, Democrats are going to need everything to go right. Just the way the congressional maps are, historical trends with what happens the year after a presidential election, Democrats are already at odds. And so for that much of the country, given all of that, to think that things aren't going in the right direction is certainly not what they want to see. And they've got to hope that they can get some of these items on their agenda passed, that they can get them implemented, and that they can have an impact, as well as, some lucky breaks for things to turn around. Those poll numbers have got to be really alarming. And remember, we're talking about 2022, but there's some elections coming up here in just a few weeks that may give us an early sense of how things are going to go for them.
Well, Kris, of course, the spending bill passing Congress hinges on, as we just heard there, all of the Democratic senators voting for the bill. We've seen Senators Manchin and Sinema, oppose various versions of this bill throughout the process. The president called both of them earlier today, and members of their caucus are calling on them to get this done. Let's go ahead and listen to some of that.
What I would say to all of my Democratic colleagues in the House and Senate alike, this is a critical piece of legislation that we have to get across the finish line. But I think that would probably be well known to every single member of my caucus. We know that we are investing in the future of America. We are making investments now in our crumbling infrastructure, in childcare, and getting rid of the state and local tax deduction cap, investments that are going to move this country forward for decades to come.
Do we know where Senators Manchin and Sinema stand on the overall framework?
Well, I don't know that anyone knows where Senator Sinema stands on the framework. She rarely talks to reporters and doesn't sound like she's talking to a lot of her colleagues here on the Hill. Her office has said she's interfacing directly with the White House. Senator Manchin, we have a better idea where Senator Manchin stands because he talks to us many, many times a day. I think he's been clear that the negotiations are continuing, that there are things in there that he doesn't fully support. Climate change, obviously, as we've heard in this discussion, remain a big factor. We know for Senator Sinema, there were some of the tax issues, increasing taxes on business, for example, has been something that she doesn't necessarily support. But there does appear to be optimism amongst Democrats that a deal can be reached. We've heard increasing talk about perhaps a framework by the end of the week. That might be a little optimistic since it's Wednesday afternoon. But I think everybody is aware that they're hoping to have this done by next week. You have surface transportation funding that expires at the end of the month. That could result in a few thousand people being furloughed and money for transportation projects and mass transit across the country being turned off. And, of course, that's also when the president goes overseas for that climate change conference. They would like to get something done by then. That is a very real reality to everybody up here on the Hill. So it's progressing. And, we sort of learn day by day what's in, what's out, and where everything stands. But, Senator Sinema seems to like being a bit of a mystery.
Okay. Well, Tim, let me ask you, the Biden administration says it's still committed to cutting carbon emissions by 2030. So how does what's happening in these negotiations complicate that goal?
That is a very difficult question, and there are a lot of differing opinions about that. The supporters of the clean electricity plan that you mentioned, that is probably on the outs at this point, would tell you that about half of the gains in greenhouse gas emissions reductions that you might see from reconciliation were coming from that plan. There are plenty of other people, a lot of industry lobbyists, and I mean, clean tech industry people who work for the wind and solar business, who say that, that's maybe not true, that you might actually even be able to get a faster deployment of clean energy if you just went with more tax credits and not the clean electricity plan. The Biden administration in recent days, as they're trying to prepare for Glasgow and maybe keep expectations from getting out of hand, have also said that they think they can come close to achieving their target of a 50% reduction by the end of the decade, even without the clean electricity plan. So, it's just that there's so much uncertainty about it, not just about what is being negotiated right now, high uncertainty there, but even about how these plans would play out once those that are agreed upon are implemented. It's, so many people have a different assessment of that. It's very hard to say.
All right. Let's turn to another issue here. Natalie, the Washington Post has new reporting on arrests at the Mexico border soaring to an all-time high, skyrocketing after President Biden took office. Is the administration considering any change in policy to stem the numbers?
They are trying to thread a needle here, I think. They have had a policy that has angered a lot of other Democrats in keeping some of President Trump's policies in place, that Title 42. But they see this as a very perilous political issue for them. We haven't talked as much about it recently as some other things that are affecting Biden's political standing right now, but immigration is one of the issues on which he polls the worst. And so you certainly are going to see some changes in handling or in messaging around it, but it's a very difficult issue for them. It's one that is not getting much better. And in fact, in times when you expected it to get better, like this summer when it was extremely hot, the numbers just went up and up and up.
All right, Kris, on another topic as well, Democrats were for a voting rights bill, but Republicans defeated it yet again today. Why is it that no members of the GOP support the bill? Is that the end of voting rights legislation?
Well, it's hard to see a path forward for this voting rights package of reforms. Republicans are uniformly against it. The talking point they use is it's a federal takeover of state elections. And frankly, it's probably not in their interest to intervene. Certainly some of the changes we have seen in states like Georgia and Texas would seem to benefit Republicans in the interim. But you just don't have 10 Republicans who are going to break with the party and vote with Democrats to move these forward. You need 60 votes in the Senate. Senator Manchin and others on the Democratic side are opposed to making changes to the filibuster. So there just doesn't appear to be a path forward for voting rights legislation. It's possible that the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which could come up to the Senate floor for a vote, may fare a little bit better, but it's hard to see even that getting 60 votes right now. This seems to be a divide right down party lines.
All right, Kris Van Cleave, Natalie Jennings, and Tim Puko, thank you all very much.